When I was very young, about 6 or 7, my parents took me to this Mexican restaurant close to where I lived. Inside, in a small room with a neon sign that said games, lay 3 arcade cabinets: Daytona USA, The Simpsons, and the combination Miss Pac Man Galaga arcade cabinet. I begged my parents for a few quarters, and off I went playing Pac Man. Then I noticed something on the side of the screen. A little sticker that said to play the original Pac Man, press up, 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 down, 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 left, right, left on the joystick. So, naturally I did, and I was hit with a blast of retro arcade goodness. It was like Miss Pac Man, but different. Simpler. I had played Miss Pac Man before playing the original, but in a strange, roundabout way, there I was playing the original Pac Man for the first time, sometime in 2002. Was I 22 years too late? Maybe, but better late than never. And every time we went back to that restaurant, I'd beg my parents for more quarters just to play Pac Man. Daytona and Simpsons could wait. I had Pac Man fever. But unfortunately, for the longest time, my only way of playing Pac Man was at that restaurant, and naturally my parents were unwilling to go there every week just so I could get my fix. So, I begged them to buy me Namco Museum 50th anniversary for the Game Boy Advance. Now, I could make an entire video about just this little compilation cart, but for the sake of staying on topic, I'll just focus on the Pac Man port. And though I say port, this is actually being emulated using code from the original arcade board. And here I am emulating it on an emulator. Huh. I'm emulating an emulator. Isn't that cerebral? It's like putting a hat on top of a hat, or refreezing your leftovers. Anyway, the gameplay is exactly like you'd expect. It's Pac Man, but on the go. The screen is squashed down to fit the Game Boy Advance's horizontal aspect ratio, but if you press select, you can switch between the screen scrolling, sideways mode, or the default squashed mode. I never really liked turning my GBA on its side, and if you have the screen scrolling, you can't see the whole maze at the same time, which really limits your field of view, making it especially easy to be blindsided by a ghost. For that reason, I always played with the screen squashed. It never really bothered me all that much anyway. Another cool feature, thankfully a holdover from the PS1 version, is the ability to mess around with the settings. Normally on the arcade machine, you'd have to go inside the cabinet and change the dip switches to do anything like that, so it's pretty nice to see even this option included in the port. But, while the GBA version does take the award for the most nostalgic Pac Man for me, we do have to talk about the elephant in the room. The scapegoat. The odd one out, you know the one, the Atari 2600 version. What a waste of time, talent, and plastic. And normally I like to keep positive on this show, but when something is a flop, it's a flop. And this one just did a belly flop, Wile E. Coyote style, and left an imprint on the floor. Well, at least we should give it a fair trial and maybe see why it turned out the way it did. Since I am far from the first person to review this port, I don't think I'll go into gory detail, but since the Atari is such a popular system to collect for, chances are you'll come across at least one copy at one point or another. In fact, it's practically a foregone conclusion you'll find one of these on your nearest Goodwill rack. Contrary to popular belief, this version wasn't actually just a prototype cast into the limelight before it could grasp the responsibility of being a retail game. The programmer, Todd Fry, though given several months to work on this game, on top of working 80-hour weeks, was not given any of the code of the original game to work from. Instead, he ended up having to play the game himself and transcribe by ear, as it were. Now, due to the technical limitations on both the type of the cartridge the game was developed on and the inherent limits of the console itself, the dots had to be changed to wafers. The maze layout changed considerably, the ghosts flicker between the 4 of them, almost like an old Tiger game, and Pac Man himself can't face up or down. But confounding things even further was Atari's policy that only space games could have a black background. So, while it was technically possible for the background to be black and the maze walls blue, Fry's hands were tied, and the game was stuck with an ugly palette reminiscent of old CGA graphics. Yuck. Now, while this port was indeed horribly mishandled, to be fair, there are some logical explanations as to why the game turned out so poorly. The flickering ghosts were less noticeable on the CRT televisions of the time due to the persistence of vision that old TVs had. Fry decided to include a 2-player mode despite the original game being 1-player only, and that took up cartridge space. And finally, the game was put on a 4KB cartridge, which was the cheaper cartridge at the time. There was a 4KB and an 8KB cartridge. Atari already had plans to release 3 to 4 million of the things, despite there not being 3 million Atari 2600s in existence yet. Atari bet that people would buy the Atari 2600 just to play the game. And they were right, sort of. While the game did sell very well, eventually the extras made their way to bargain bins, landfills, and the collection shelves of game collectors everywhere. Now, remember how I mentioned the cartridge size? Well, I did that for a reason. Recently, fans have taken to produce homebrew versions of the game that better utilize the capabilities of both the cartridge and the Atari 2600. There are 2 main versions, but for brevity's sake, I'll just play Pac Man 8K. The difference is night and day! It's amazing to think that the Atari could do all of this if it's programmed right. The ghosts still flicker a bit, but that's an inherent limitation of the system. Other than that, it's the best port possible on the system. The graphics, sound, gameplay, it's all there and plays smooth. Everything down to the fruits has been painstakingly made to work on Atari 2600. It all looks the way it should. And that makes the real port even more disappointing, because even though the 2600 could do all of this, instead we got this. There have of course been tons of ports of the game. Perhaps the most well-known home port, and maybe even the best port at the time, was the NES version. It's for good reason. It's a solid reproduction of the arcade experience for the home console. I'd say if you want a good retro home console experience, play this version. Now, of course, Pac-Man's received a lot of love in recent years. A sort of retro resurgence has kept Pac-Man in the limelight ever since the original release, and there's not a lot of people who don't know who he is. And there's been a Pac-Man game on just about every home system for decades now. Heck, even Google got Pac-Man fever 10 years ago on the 30th anniversary of the Little Yellow Circle. And now that I'm saying that, here in 2020, we're coming up on the 40th anniversary of Pac-Man. Yeah, Pac-Man is officially older than the internet. Pac-Man is older than 99% of today's American top 40 artists. Pac-Man is older than the leftover Chinese food sitting in my fridge. Pac-Man is older than Jimi Hendrix. And as long as he sleeps face down, it'll stay that way. Catch you on the flip side.